Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with EC Syncowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, and how are you, EC?
Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's good to see you. We are today going to, I was joking before we hit record, we're going to do kind of a hot cake, but only one hot cake. And we're going real deep into it. So we're going to talk
about a really
about
big hot cake.
Yeah, one really big hot cake. We're going to talk about a study that looks at the correlation between sugar intake and Alzheimer's disease. And this was sparked by a social media post that a listener sent you. So give us a little bit of background. We'll get into the post and then we'll kind of break it down.
Yeah, exactly. So Marie wanted a take on an Instagram post about sugar disease and Alzheimer's risk. She was particularly concerned because that runs in her family. So obviously looking for different ways to reduce that risk. And it really, it was kind of like originally like, oh, just take a quick look at the post. But then it led me into all these different directions. Like, okay, first we have to understand what the post is saying. We also have to understand the study that they're citing. But then ultimately, like how to help people really understand all this risk that they're facing in the headlines that are just coming at us all the time, every day. So ended up being a really big hot cake.
I love it. I think you're doing here what everybody does with a social media post, which is you look at it and then you spend 3 hours analyzing it, right? That's what I do with every single. That's why I get nothing else done.
I know.
Because social media just takes all day long. Okay, so here's the post. Again, this was on Instagram. The text on the post, and then I'll get into a little bit of the caption because it adds some context. On the post itself, it says, brain tip, don't sugarcoat it. There's a startling link for women between their sweet tooth and the chance of developing Alzheimer's and other dementias. And then in the caption, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit to shorten it. This is a quote. A recent study indicates that excessive total sugar intake is significantly associated with Alzheimer's risk in women. They found those who consumed about 10 grams, 2.4 teaspoons of sugar daily had the largest risk increase. Lactose, the sugar found in milk and milk products, had the strongest link to Alzheimer's among the sugar types studied. Managing cholesterol and blood sugar levels early may help lower the risk of developing Alzheimer's later. One practical way to reduce sugar intake is limiting or eliminating sugary beverages. A separate study found that higher consumption of sugar in beverages was associated with increased risk of dementia, Alzheimer's, and stroke. How much sugar is in your diet? So that was most of the caption on the post itself. So let's, as you said before, you sort of went deep into this. So where should we begin?
Yeah, this post is kind of a wild ride because, the basic, really top level information is fine, but it's the specifics that they cite are actually wrong. And then when you go into the comments, you see this kind of utter confusion about that, and understandably so. And so big picture, yes, there is this link between excessive sugar intake and cognitive decline. We've talked about this before. Generally, poor diets increase your risk of every disease. None of this should be surprising to our audience. And really, the excessive intake is coming from that processed food and the standard American diet. We could really almost first point out to sugar-sweetened beverages, soda. It's the first place to start. And we've also talked about soda specifically in an older podcast, which I'll put in the show notes. And so to this post's credit, the caption does end quite well, identifying a great place for people to start. And that's cutting out soda. And so I really do like that. And I, again, agree with the general premise that excessive sugar intake is a problem, increases risk. The wrong part, unfortunately, is when they're actually quoting the results of that study. So the post is whole spurred by this recent study, but then they actually misquote the study. And so the study was looking at sugar consumption, as it says, and specifically tallied sugar consumption according to different types of sugar: glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, etc. Now, if you were here for that recent podcast on anti-nutrients, drilling down to that level of composition of a food should already give you pause, but we'll come back to that. And what they're saying is that those who consumed about 10 grams, as you said, only 2.4 teaspoons, 10 grams of sugar daily had the largest risk increase. But the abstract doesn't even say that. That's a completely wrong quote. So this is the Lou paper in the show notes. So whoever wrote the caption just got the data wrong. What the paper actually says is an estimated increase of 10 grams of sugar a day in total sugar intake. Of the 6 subtypes of sugar intake, lactose was significantly associated with Alzheimer's disease risk, end quote. Remember, the social media post said that you have a risk at 10 grams total of sugar intake. And what I just kind of read back to you was that every 10 grams increasing you intake, there's an increased risk. And what's so interesting to me about the fact that they got that just quote wrong from the study directly is there was nobody to sanity check that value of 10 grams of sugar. To say that there's a risk at consuming of 10 grams sugar total, it's so low. It's so low compared to what recommendations are, and we'll get into that. But I think that's what's the first kind of top level thing for people to understand is there's just wrong information, period, on social media. Well, any media, really. But you just have to remember that there's lots of errors which can occur. We've got the study, which there could be errors. Then we have the person who interpreting the study, they could have errors. And then we have the person who's posting on social media, which oftentimes is contracted out to the non-expert, could literally either misinterpret the caption or just typo it incorrectly. And so we just have to keep in mind that there are errors, and remembering that phrase, don't believe everything you see online is true, or whatever it is.
Okay. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. That's the lesson so far. Okay, so as we joked before, you are the only person to see a social media post and then actually go find the study. But we're going to talk about the study. We're going to dive into it. And there were two big things that you wanted from that study, from their findings, that we wanted to talk about. So number one, how big an increased risk is it to consume sugar? And then number two, what is the dose of sugar that increases that risk? So let's do that first one first. How big an increased risk is this sugar consumption?
Yeah, so they actually were looking at women only, but they divided the women into 4 groups from low sugar intake, and then they had kind of 2 middle ranges of sugar intake, and then the 4th group was a high level of sugar intake. And the high level of sugar intake had this 19% increased risk of Alzheimer's compared to the low group. So again, as sugar intake went up, so did Alzheimer's disease risk. But that 19% is the relative risk increase. And this is what headlines, again, use all of the time, the relative risk increase. And I want to kind of walk through some number examples. Now, Alzheimer's is really interesting because risk is highly dependent on age. But let's just take this as an example. About 8 in 100 people develop Alzheimer's disease between the ages of 65 and 84. So 8 in 100 is the absolute risk. So that 19% increase is relative to that 8 number. So a 19% increase from 8 is an additional 1.5 people. Meaning if you eat a high amount of sugar, your risk of developing Alzheimer's is 9.5 out of 100. And we don't have half people, so we could really say that your risk is 10 in 100 people. So what this is saying is consuming a high amount of sugar in your diet, you move from a risk of 8 in 100 to 10 in 100. Now that doesn't sound nearly as scary as saying an increase of 19% risk. Yet that's what the headlines give you all the time. You aren't ever given this, I don't want to say never, but almost never, given the perspective of what the absolute risk is, which is moving from 8 in 100 to 10 in 100. Now, I do want to say that an increase of 19%, close to 20%, is certainly not irrelevant, because when you play that number out, even though relatively small, once we did the absolute risk, across millions and millions of people, we're actually talking about a lot of different people. But I think it is important to understand the context of the risk. And it's also important to understand that dietary factors generally at best will only change your risk to about this level, about 20%. And then there are lots of other factors which often will change your risk to a much greater degree. And genetics is a great example. I mean, genetics can change your risk by, let's say, 400% in some diseases, right? Many, many times more than this 20%. That would be kind of the best move we would see from a dietary point of view. But again, that risk, that 20% increase risk was if you were at the highest level of intake. Remember I said that there were 4 different groups. There's an average amount. There's people that are in the middle, which is going to represent more of the people in the US, such that your relative risk is even going to be less than that 19%. Okay, and I think the last thing I want to point out here is I think this is a big misstep that I know I fell under for certain times when seeing headlines historically, is I think when you see something like, your risk of Alzheimer's goes up by 19%, you forget that your baseline level has risk, meaning it's not that you have zero risk of developing Alzheimer's and then by eating sugar, you now have this higher risk. Everyone everyone has risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then it's factors like diet and genetics modify that level of risk. And I think we forget that. You think, oh, if I just eliminate sugar, I have no risk. It's like, no. You have risk regardless. Now, how much sugar can change that?
Got it. Okay. Second part was dose. What was the sugar intake when that increased risk occurred?
Yeah, we always have to ask, like, well, how much sugar are they talking about, right?
Right.
Like, was it really this 10-gram amount that they kind of put in the social media post? And so the low sugar intake, remember I said that there was kind of 4 groups of sugar intake they look at. The low sugar group was at 54 grams per day, and the high group was at 174 grams per day. And this is where I actually have a criticism of the study. I wasn't totally clear on how they were classifying sugar. So when I said that the low group was 54 grams of sugar, I'm like, what exactly are they totaling there? Are they totaling up all naturally occurring sugars, or are they just totaling up added sugars? And to be honest, I think it's towards added sugars, because those numbers for total sugars would be pretty low relative to the American diet. So I don't totally know how they were defining and classifying sugar, which makes it hard to interpret the results. And just as an aside, I sent out an email a couple months ago that was looking at fructose consumption relative to Alzheimer's risk. And guess what? When they were totaling fructose consumption, they excluded fruit. And that's what you try to discern when you're looking at the methods. Like, how are they classifying sugar? What do they count as sugar? Because that's going to really help you interpret the results. And I didn't totally understand that by looking at this study. And admittedly, I didn't look at all of the supplemental material either. So we have this issue is I'm not totally sure how they're classifying sugar. But beyond that, we have the usual problems of putting too much weight on something like this, which is this association study. Meaning we don't know if that total intake sugar that they measured, that 54 grams or that 147 grams, we don't know if that total sugar intake was excessive to the person. Maybe sugar is associated with Alzheimer's, but it's really because the person is just having too much quantity overall in the diet. They're eating too much, ice cream and pizza. It's not that any one type of sugar that's a problem. It's just that their foods overall have too much quantity. We also have to remember with these association studies, and I really love this point, is that reverse causation idea. Meaning when I presented this study, or when the social media post presented this study, I think the assumption is, oh, wow, eating sugar is driving my Alzheimer's disease risk. But in association studies, it can go the other way around. What if I developed Alzheimer's disease because of my genetics, but the disease and its effect on my brain capacity changed my diet behaviors? I don't have the same mental faculties, and so now I'm making different diet choices. That's very possible. And so with these association studies, we don't know which direction the data is going. And what's really also interesting here, and this is something so fascinating to me about when we look at diet and stuff like cognition and dementia, is how accurate is the data that's being reported? If somebody is developing dementia or Alzheimer's disease, maybe their diet actually hasn't changed in reality, but their ability to recall their diet has. What a trip is that, right? So maybe the underlying data suggests there's a difference when really it's just a difference in their recall ability, not actually their intake. And so these are some of the things that we have to be really careful of when we look at something like an association study, especially with dementia. But I do want to come back to that 10-gram thing that they called out. As I mentioned, it's not that the highest risk occurred at a total amount of 10 grams. It's that with every 10 grams added sugar, your risk goes up by 1.3, 1.4%. Said another way, if you increase your sugar consumption by 100 grams, you increase your relative risk by about 14%. That's way different than saying that somebody who consumed a total of 10 grams has a really high risk. And yeah, the study did find that lactose had this highest risk when they were looking at the sugar specifically. But again, are we talking about lactose in ice cream, pizza, or plain Greek yogurt? And when you take this step back and you look at the whole foods, instead of, let's say, lactose specifically or glucose specifically, such as the Wu paper in the show notes, we find that there's a decreased risk of cognitive decline, including Alzheimer's, with milk consumption. And so I love this as like the counterpoint, because again, one of the weaknesses of this association study is that it was breaking the food down into its different components, where here, if we take a step back and look at like, okay, well, how is this food consumed? And what does that type of food probably say about the person's whole diet? I think is a much stronger study to look at in terms of kind of relative risks than necessarily trying to drill down into lactose specifically.
One quick clarifying question. It's an association study. Does that mean that at a certain point in somebody's life, they said, hey, can you tell us what your diet has looked like? And then based on that, and based on maybe whether or not in this case of this study, you have or are showing signs of Alzheimer's, then we can sort of reverse engineer based on what you said and based on where you are now, we can assume a couple of things. Is that kind of how a study like this would work? Okay.
Yes. And I'd have to go back to look at the number of years this spanned, but essentially you get 2 questionnaires. Sometimes it's more, but oftentimes it's like, let's say they're looking across 8 years. You're going to get a questionnaire on day 0. You're going to get a questionnaire on the end of 8 years. And you yourself, Patrick, you would check off, this is how many sodas I had over the course of a week, generally. You're just trying to describe your diet generally. You're trying to say, okay, this is typically how many servings of fruit I eat. This is typically how many servings of pizza I eat. So all of that stuff is really subject to recallability.
Yes.
And just the biases that someone has about what they believe their own diet to be.
Yep.
Once you start understanding that so many nutrition studies are done that way, you have to really step back and kind of use them very loosely to try to understand about trends in somebody's diet versus being like, oh, they really understand the lactose consumption they are doing. I mean, come on.
Right. It's not exactly this, but it's also sort of which you've talked about before, the Hawthorne effect, which is when somebody's watching you, you're on better behavior. And I can imagine, okay, I'm filling out this form that is asking me what my diet looks like. And I know what I would like it to say. And I might make it say that instead of what might be more accurate. Because again, something you've said a lot, which is people aren't very good at estimating what they've actually eaten. So let alone hey, give me an average week of your life for the last 8 years. I mean, goodness gracious. I eat a lot of fruit. I eat a lot of vegetables and I don't eat any sugar. Like that's what most people would like to believe.
Now, what's interesting is they're called food frequency questionnaires. They're used all the time in these association studies. The method has been validated in the sense that we know that the data that we get from people tends to be consistent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate. So we know that it's okay to get a broad sense of what they understand about their diet, but we can't say from it, oh, they're definitely eating 2,000 calories per day. We can't say that, but we know that when they come back to their food frequency questionnaire, they're going to answer it in a similar way that they did previously. So it's repeatable in that sense, but you really don't want to take really strong opinions about diet composition from it.
Got it. Okay. So given all of that, what can we actually learn from this, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the really loose, broad brushstrokes that we talk about all the time, a poor quality diet, particularly a poor quality diet that's excess in calories, is going to increase your risk for lots of diseases. And I guess if you're not following a lot of nutrition information, it can be kind of surprising to learn that food has this sort of impact on your health risk. But I think for anyone listening to this podcast for more than a few episodes, we already confidently know that poor diets increase your health risk of virtually every disease so long as it wasn't determined exclusively by genetics, right? So that's a broad brushstroke you can certainly take from the study, but I think a lot of us already know that here. In terms of the study, I think we kind of just went through, I think there's too many limitations to really say much more than eat mostly whole and processed foods and don't eat more than your body needs. And I want to bring up, too, that I think because I kind of hinted at that 10-gram amount that they threw out in the social media caption is so low, I think our existing recommendations for people about added sugar are quite good. And so when I talk about this thing of like, don't eat more than your body needs, sometimes for people who aren't necessarily ready to, let's say, weigh and measure everything and go through something like my masterclass process, that looking at your added sugar can be a really nice bigger picture view of your diet and how you're doing in terms of these processed foods. You don't need to drill down to the fact of like, am I eating lactose or fructose, but instead look at, hey, what's my overall added sugar in the diet? And I think, it depends whether or not you look at the USDA or the American Health Association, but very generally, if you keep your added sugar below 50 grams a day, you're doing pretty well on the processed foods front. And in the US, great news, the added sugar is specifically now required to be called out on labels under carbohydrates. And so you don't necessarily have to weigh and measure everything. But if you take 2 or 3 days and just legitimately take the time to add up the added sugar, I think this is a great way to, not perfectly, but start to understand kind of the processed foods in your diet relative to where you should be.
That's an interesting, that would be an interesting experiment. I like that. I made a note to ask you about risk and relative risk, because it's one of those things, you did math, which I know, like, I'll raise my hand, like people start talking math at me and my eyes glaze over a little bit. So how can we do, what can we do to better understand risk and relative risk in the context of like, okay, I saw the headline, it said this increases my risk, my relative risk. Like, how do we start to wrap our heads around that so it's not so ephemeral?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a great answer for this. I think the first thing is just understanding that headlines use relative risk. And so you're missing the context for how to determine how risky this really is. And there was this book I just actually finished reading, Up to Your Armpits and Alligators, which, as much as I love the content, guys, the headline is not helping you become a New York Times bestseller.
Up to Your Armpits and Alligators. That's not a kid's book?
Yeah, it's trying to help you exactly do this, understand all of these headlines around you and understand which risks should I really pay attention to and which ones can I kind of ignore. And what they do, I think it's quite genius, is they propose a system kind of like the Richter scale for earthquakes. Mm-hmm. We all know the Richter scale, yet I mean, I'm not a geologist. I don't actually know all the calculations that go into it and how they're measuring the magnitude of it. But yet we know that when you hear a 6, that will place in your mind that was a pretty bad earthquake. And that could be true whether or not it was in Japan or California, right? And yet we also know that a 4 is much, much, much less risky than a 6, even though they're technically only 2 numbers apart. So they have this ability to give us a sense of magnitude and orders of magnitude that change on a really simple scale. And so they suggest, how cool would it be if when you have this headline of X, Y, and Z increases your risk, that they actually put it on a similar scale like a Richter scale. And they propose a scale would go from actually -6 to +6. And -6 would be like almost never happening, like 0 chance of happening. And then a 0 would be a 1 in 1 million chance, and a 6 would be a 1 in 1 chance. Like, we all have a 6 chance of dying at some point. It's definitely going to happen. So as you go up on this,
speak for yourself, EC. Speak for yourself.
You're going to be the first one. But as we go up on this scale from -6 to 6, it really increases our risk quite dramatically, just like the Richter scale. But the point of doing this would be like, you could put, and they are actually they talk about environmental regulations quite a lot, like exposure risk that we've talked about, but you could put something like, okay, what's your risk of glyphosate exposure in oatmeal on this scale relative to other risks that we see all of the time? And they point out that things in the 0 to 2 range are a risk level that we're quite comfortable with. Like, you actually have I found this stat amazing, a 1 in 10,000 risk of dying in your home from some accident. And that would be on a 2 on this scale. And yet, I don't think anybody's thinking about their risk of dying in their house today, right? It's about the same risk, too, as a woman has dying during childbirth. And this, again, falls around a 2 on their scale. Yet there's no headlines on a daily basis that says, like, giving birth increases death risk, right? These are known risks that we have, and they're known risks that we've just sort of accepted. We continue to live our life. We can't, like, think about every day, oh my gosh, I might die from giving birth, or I might die by sitting in my house today. Like, we just can't do it. So we have to, like, kind of go through the day, right? And so, to put this then in further perspective on their scale, your risk of dying in a highway accident across driving 50 years of your life is actually at a 1 in 100 or a +4 on their scale. That's really risky, and yet that's another risk that we take all of the time and don't think about at all. And so they suggest that a lot of stuff in the media is actually kind of in the -2 to -4 realm, almost on the level of almost not going to happen at all. Maybe happens to one person in the world, but yet it's eye-catching, and so they bring us in. And so how useful this would be to be able to see where these headlines are on this scale so that we understand the context of it. I will say this won't happen in the foreseeable future at all, because it takes the power away from interest groups and media, right? Like, why would they do this? They want to suck us in with the headlines. But I think that's really the takeaway here, is when you see the headline, it's a relative increase, and that it's probably much bigger than the true risk change if we looked at the whole context. And the basics that we talk about all the time, eat the right amount of calories, eat enough quality within those calories, exercise regularly, don't drink more alcohol than the kind of moderate amount, is going to lower your risk as best possible of all of the diseases. And that's about it. You can stop looking at the headlines. They're trying to scare you with the relative risk.
With that in mind, the understanding of relative risk, and I really like this idea of the Richter scale of risk. I think that's really interesting. Is there anything to say or add as it relates to the actual study that we have been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, let's go ahead and put the study on this Richter scale, right? This is what's really interesting. I mentioned that the risk of getting Alzheimer's is actually just under 10%. Like I said, it was 8 out of 10, which would be just under a +5 on this scale. So that's higher than the risk of dying from something in your house and not driving on the highway for 50 years. It's above that. So we actually have a lot of risk of developing Alzheimer's between 65 and 84. And a lot of that is just from age. Our increasing your age is going to increase a lot of these disease risks. So it's just under a +5 on this scale. So what does eating way more sugar do? It would move it from just under a +5 to just on a +5. So the shift in what the diet is doing is very, very small relative to where you already are. Now, I don't want people to take that as oh, well, I'm just eating donuts. You have to remember that a healthy diet will have risk implications across a lot of diseases besides Alzheimer's. But the point is, the headline can really make you worried about, let's say, 10 grams of lactose without understanding that the real risk here is actually aging. Aging is our big problem with Alzheimer's, not necessarily a 10-gram increase. And yes, of course, I believe in whole foods, but it's kind of understanding we're talking about really slight shifts.
Okay, so we just really need to work on this aging thing, is what you're saying.
Let's just end aging.
Thank you, C. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews, especially for your reviews. We had a couple of really nice reviews come in recently, and it always makes us feel good to see. So if you haven't yet left us a review and been listening for a while, we'd love to see it. We'd love to read it, and thank you in advance. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.